guys, welcome back to Asher Books. So today I'm going to be talking about my favorite fantasy romances. Now originally I wanted to do like a top 10 favorite fantasy romances, but in making this list, I discovered that that was just impossible for me. Like I just couldn't narrow it down to 10. And as it is, so I've got a top 12, and then I've got some honorable mentions because I just couldn't leave them off. I will say I am a really big fantasy romance person. It's definitely probably my favorite genre within romance, so I think that's why it was a little more difficult to make this. I am hoping to make some more lists in the future of top 10 like historical romances, paranormal romances. I might do contemporary, things like that. So let me know if that would be something you'd be interested in. I don't know if I've ever done a top 10 for these genres. If I have, it's been a few years, so it's probably time for an update anyways. But without further ado, let's jump into my favorites. So here's the thing. I can't go into a large amount of detail, even though I want to, because we would be here forever. So if you think you like the sound of the book, definitely check it out on Goodreads or Amazon or wherever you want to look it up. You can also message me if you want to know more about it. I'd be happy to message in the comments or whatever. But these are just my absolute favorites. If I have to pick favorite fantasies now, I will say also another caveat before we get started is I didn't make a separate list for favorite fantasies because, to be honest with you, even if some of these wouldn't necessarily be categorized in the fantasy romance section, I personally think they are fantasy romances because they're all ones that have a pretty strong romantic subplot, at least. There are a few a little bit lesser romantic subplots than others, so if there is one like that, I'll try and mention it when I chat about it so you guys know kind of what you're getting into. But it's rare for me to read a fantasy without it having a romance, so I just kind of put it all together in one list. Like I said though, I didn't put paranormal on this list because I am gonna, I think, make a separate video about anything that's like vampires, shifters, like witches, like in our world. I think I'm gonna do a separate video for that. So that's why I didn't mention a couple of my favorite in that genre, especially things like Stay a Spell by Juliet Cross and stuff like that. So that's why it's not listed. Okay, so to start off, I've got a couple series that just had to be on the list that are from years ago. These are ones that have like done the test of time and are still favorites. And the first one is the Shatter Me series by Tahereh Mafi. This is book 3. I realize that. It's just my favorite cover, so I'm holding up this one. But I've seen so many people recently picking up this series again, which makes me super happy because it's probably one of my all-time faves. Now again, is it dystopian? Is it fantasy? Could probably be either one. I'm calling it a fantasy. Listen, absolute favorite. Tahereh Mafi's writing is some of my favorite. She has a really beautiful way of taking kind of a little bit of a flowery writing style and mixing it with this fantasy elements and world and dialogue in a way that just totally works for me, makes it very addicting. And I just have to say that the couple in this book, I'm not gonna say who it is because I do think that's a spoiler, but the couple that ultimately gets together from this series is one of my all-time favorites and will never be kicked off that list. They're always gonna make it. Juliet as a main character, I think, is such a strong female character. She, from where you see her in that first book to where she ends up, is just like leaps and bounds, and she just really grows into herself. There's so many amazing side characters. This is a series I really want to reread again, but I just don't know if I have the time. But part of me is like, I don't care. Read it. Like, if you haven't, read it. All right, in a similar vein, an OG series for me is the Shadowhunters series by Cassandra Clare, but specifically, if I have to pick favorites, it's gotta be the Infernal Devices. It's gotta be the Infernal Devices. Technically, this is like a prequel series to the original Shadowhunters. However, I think you could definitely, there's a lot of different ways you can do the reading order, so maybe look it up, but I do think you could start either with City of Bones or this one and be okay. I think kind of your preference. I did read this after Shadowhunters because I read them as they came out. So, because I'm old. Love this series so much. It's set in the 1800s. It's fantasy. It has really about Jem, Tessa, and Will, and Tessa is kind of like a warlock, and Jem and Will are shadow hunters and basically fighting demons and that kind of thing. it's just such a good series, guys. And this has a love triangle, which I don't normally like, and it's so well done. You're gonna be a sobbing mess in this book, in this series. It's such, like, the characters just come alive. It's such a fantastical setting, and I again, have seen people picking up this series recently as well. And I'm really happy that some of these slightly older series are kind of having a resurgence. Definitely would call this a fantasy romance. Like, it probably wasn't marketed as that back in the day, but the romantic subplot in these books is pretty steady, so I would say it is. Next, we come up to how I absolutely cheated on this list, but it's fine. It's my list, so it doesn't matter. And that is the fact that if I included all of Sarah J Maas's different series as different places on this list, it would be like half made up of her, right? So I'm including all of Sarah J Maas's books into one spot because I love her writing. I know that she's very hyped. I know she's very popular. I know it's nothing new, but like, she deserves a spot on this list. Like, absolutely. These are not ranked, by the way. This is not like 1 to 12 because that would be truly impossible for me to do. These are just in general my top 12 fantasy romances. So I picked up Heir of Fire to show you. I think this is my favorite, and well, maybe not the favorite, one of my favorite in Throne of Glass, but ACOTAR, Court of Thorns and Roses, Throne of Glass, and City of, or what's the other one called? And the Crescent City series are all just, they're so good, guys. Like, I know I'm not sharing anything new, but they deserved a place on this list. So I just kind of merged them all together into one. But I'm not speaking anything new. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these series. But if you're like me, though, and haven't finished the rest, a lot of people I know have read ACOTAR and Crescent City, but not this one. Pick it up. I feel like I keep saying that, but like, really do. It's so good, and I definitely think these are all qualified as fantasy romances. ACOTAR maybe a teensy bit more fantasy romance than this series, but this one has a couple different romances that I think are really just like the heartstones of these stories. So next we have a series that I kind of wavered whether to put on top 12 or as like an honorable mention because I didn't love the first book in this series, but I'm talking about the Kingdom of the Cursed, Kingdom of the Wicked series by Carrie Maniscalco. The first book wasn't my favorite. It was like a 4-star, but I could see where the roots were and I could see where she was hopefully going with this series, and I just really liked the idea of it. So this one's my favorite in the series, which is Kingdom of the Cursed, and this book follows Amelia, who in the first book, her sister dies, and obviously she's going through that painful experience and trauma, and through that ends up making this deal with, it's basically the 7 deadly sins, but wrath is the one that she meets, and it goes from there. And it's this book and that third one, you get taken to a different setting. The first one primarily takes place in Italy, in kind of a fantastical Italy, but still Italy, and the second and third you go to kind of their realm of the like Wrath's realm, and I just thought it was really well done, the way she painted that picture of it, picture the world so perfectly. And I thought the magic in this, I thought the way that the deadly sins were woven in and they all had different houses was just really cool, really unique. And it's dark, it's kind of edgy, I feel like, and it's super fun. So at the end of the day, it deserves a spot on the list. But if you do read the first book and don't love it, I do really encourage you to read the second one and see if maybe that one works for you better, because it definitely did for me. This is a series that, again, kind of could probably fit in the paranormal video as well, but I do think it's an urban fantasy, so we're gonna go with it. And that is the Kate Daniel series by Alona Andrews. I despise this cover, and I cannot wait for the day that these will get a new cover, because I do not like. But this series is fantastic. It is urban fantasy, so it's set in Atlanta, but like a different kind of Atlanta. I think it's supposed to be like Atlanta of like the future. It involves shifters, and then obviously our main character is Kate Daniels, who's like a mercenary, and it's such a cool series. I flew through this series. I love it. I know it's been around a long time, but if you haven't picked it up yet, definitely do. It does have magic in it. It has shifters, like I said. There's a love interest. So with Kate, her love interest is a shifter. I will say in this series, if you're going in for the romance, just know it's a super slow burn. You gotta be committed for like the whole series because you don't really get much of the romance in the first couple of books, but once you get past that, it really starts to blossom. And I loved watching, I'm not saying who because I'm trying not to spoil it, but the romance really was such a high point for me. It's just such a cool series, and I think it definitely deserves all of the hype that it gets. It's such a classic, and I loved it. The next one is For the Wolf by Hannah Witten, and this is one that I haven't read the second book yet, and usually if I haven't read the second book, I don't include them on my favorites necessarily because I kind of want to see what's going to happen. However, this series really is written as like standalones, but in the same world because they're all following different couples. So this one follows our first main two characters, and I'm not going to lie. So this one follows our first two main characters, and here's the thing with this book. I just felt so like atmospheric. I felt so kind of swept into this world. I read it in the fall and I just had the best time with it. It's such a beautifully written book, and I think the way that the characters and the world, and it's very like foresty, and there's a lot of like magic that's tied to the forest and the forest kind of coming alive, and this house that's kind of been starting to take it over by the forest, as well as our main hero in the book. But it's just such a cool world. I felt like it deserved a spot on my top 10. Again, I haven't read the second book. I do want to, and I will say these aren't as, at least this one wasn't as like fast paced as a lot of the other fantasies on this list. It takes a little bit of time to kind of get through this. So pick this up when you've got a minute and kind of want to just dive into a world more than just like getting on with the action. Okay, the next one is one I feel like I don't talk about enough, and that is We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Fazal. I apologize if I said that incorrectly. I loved this book. It's a duology, so it's this one and just the second book, and I gave them both 5 stars when I read them. It's such a different kind of take on it. So this series is inspired by kind of ancient Arabia, and I just loved it. It was magical. It was such, I think I went back and looked at my review and I said something like, it's such a magical ride, and that's totally the case. Our main character is it Zafira, and she's known as like the hunter. She dresses up as a man basically and is doing things and hunting things to help provide her people and her family with food, and is in not the best position. And then the other main character that's in this book is called Nasir, and he's called the Prince of Death, and he is basically the prince to this really corrupt kingdom, and the two of them end up having to team up and go on this kind of magical journey. And if you want something a little different, I could not recommend this enough. It's just so magical, and I know I've said that a lot, but I loved it. And I will say this is one that I wouldn't necessarily say is 100% a fantasy romance. I do think the fantasy elements do outweigh the romance a little bit, but obviously there is a romance in this that I think is very good, and it's a good balance for me. And if you are like me and do want a romance in your fantasies, just know I've got you. This one does have a fantasy in it, or it does have a romance in the fantasy, but it's just maybe not as big of a role as others. But there's only 2 books too, so if you want something that's like really well written, super magical, but like only has 2 books, like pick up this duology. It's really good. The next one is one I feel like I don't hear enough people talking about, and that is really anything by C.L. Wilson. But the series I think that deserves a spot on my top 12 it's the Terran Soul series, but the first book in that series is called Lord of the Fading Lands. I know some people really like these covers. They're not my cup of tea, but again, don't let that not make you pick up the books, okay? C.L. Wilson's a really great fantasy romance writer. I also love The Winter King from them. I'm pretty sure C.L. Wilson's a woman, but I'm not 100%, so I'll just say them. But I love that book as well. But this series is just epic because it is a whole series. And I read it a couple years ago. I listened to a lot of it on audiobook. It has Fae in it, and basically the Fae is King Rain, the Terran Soul, and he's king of these like fading lands, hence the title. And in the first book, the main female character is named Elisetta, well, throughout the whole series, but you meet her, and she lives in, I think it was supposed to be like the human realm, but like near the Fading Lands, if I'm remembering correctly. But they basically, like, he hears her calling to him kind of, and comes to her, and they're basically soulmates, and that's basically where the story kicks off. So I'm reading the back here because I'm trying to figure out how to explain this without spoiling stuff. But it says, Eliseta, a woodcarver's daughter, calls to Rain in a way no other ever had. Mysterious and magical, her soul beckons him with a compelling, seductive song, and no matter the cost, the wildness in his blood will not be denied. As an ancient, familiar evil regains its strength, causing centuries-old alliances to crumble and the threatening doom for Rain and his people, he must claim his true mate to embrace the destiny woven for them both in the mist of time. Like, that is a really good back cover, and if that doesn't make you want to read it, I really can't. So it's just such a good fantasy romance series. It's another one I kind of want to reread, but it's like 6 books, so it's a large commitment. But again, if you haven't read this, pick it up. I think a lot of libraries have it as well, so good. Next one is another super popular one, but it had to have a spot on my list, and that is the From Blood and Ash series by Jennifer Armentrout. Again, I love this series. It's such a popular one, but for a reason. Again, do I think this book is perfect or this series is perfect? No, I don't. But I still think that the way Jennifer Armentrout writes her characters will never be wrong for me. I've been a fan of her for years and years before she was in the fantasy and she wrote more contemporary, and her writing works for me. It doesn't work for everybody, it works for me. I get so sucked into these books. They're magical, and I don't even know how to explain the first book because I feel like we're so far into the series now. I'm trying to like remember where we're at the beginning of the series, but basically it's about Poppy, and she's known as the Maiden. In this world, the Maiden is like untouched. She's very like held up on this pedestal of perfection, and in this series they have creatures that are kind of like vampires that they ascend to become. Amy's a guard who comes on to guard her, and things unravel from there, and it's a wild ride, y'all. And I'm having a really hard time describing this series because I just think so much happens, and we're on book like 4 or 5 now, so, and they're chunky, so a lot happens. But again, if you love fantasy romance, give it a shot. This is definitely a either works for you or doesn't type of series, because I definitely have friends who love it and some who just, it was not for them, and that's cool. It doesn't have to be for everybody. I would say if you don't completely get this one, again, read the second book, because the second book is, I think, my favorite still. Just so much expands in the world with the love interest as well. This one's also pretty heavy on the romance, pretty heavy on the steam, so just know that going in. The C.L. Wilson series, by the way, I don't think I said, but that one I'd say is pretty high on the romance. Well, it's definitely like romance, almost maybe topping the fantasy, but I mean, it's set in a fantasy world with fae, so they're kind of going hand in hand. So, but I love this series. Again, pick it up if you haven't. And then a couple that I don't have a physical copy, well, one I don't have a physical copy of, which is a crime. I really need to buy it, and that's Radiance by Grace Draven. I love this book so much. I know it's kind of, again, nothing different. A lot of people love this book, but for good reason. This one is definitely it's an arranged marriage kind of romance, but it's taking kind of a twist on that. Kind of a Beauty and the Beast type of thing. So this is definitely it's an arranged marriage, and they're from 2 different races. Our female character is human. Our male character is not. Like, he's kind of, I guess you'd call it a monster. I don't know. He doesn't look like a human. And the 2 of them basically are arranged in this marriage to help their families and don't really have much choice about it. But they kind of make the best of the situation and really become friends first, and honestly can't stand the look of each other. Like, they think they're each kind of repulsive, but they fall in love because they fall in love with who they really are. And it's so warm and squishy inside, or that's how it makes me feel. I love this book. The second one is also really good, but the first one is amazing. So if you haven't picked up Radiance, definitely belongs on my list, and you need to. Grace Draven's a beautiful writer. Next one I want to talk about is the Kingmaker series by Amanda Boucher. This is like my baby. I feel like I talk about this one all the time, or I used to at least. I do have a copy of this, but I tried to get it off the top shelf, and I actually ended up hitting it like behind the shelf. So I gotta go get that in a minute. But this series is so good. I love this. This is definitely a true fantasy romance. The fantasy and the romance are definitely going hand in hand, but it follows Kat and Griffin. When you first meet Kat, she is kind of on the run. She's in hiding, and she's basically pretending to be this person in this traveling like carnival. And Griffin is a warrior who comes to this carnival and knows exactly who she is. Like, there's no hiding it. And he has recently put his sister on the throne in his land. So she's the queen, and he knows that Kat is hiding a gift, and she's called, I can't remember what it's called, but basically she can tell if someone's lying. And it's a really helpful gift, and he wants to take her back to his sister to help her with, you know, getting power in her rule and all that. And so he basically takes her hostage. And that whole sequence of like them going back and her basically being dragged back with him is really good. We got forced proximity, we've got, you know, grumpy character, we've got people who don't really want to be there but like are forced to. It's such a cool fantasy world and setting, and a lot of inspired mythology in this one, and it's just really cool. It's gonna always probably be one of my top fantasy romances. The new book that was like the spin-off of the original trilogy came out last year. Loved it as well. Just, if you haven't already picked this up from me gushing about it in the past, you need to. It's so fantastic. Love it. The last one definitely just eked out its spot on this, which is kind of why I wanted to make this video, was the War of Lost Heart series by Carissa Broadbent. So the first one was Daughter of No World. I just finished this trilogy last month and absolutely loved it. It's hard, I would say, to bump something off my top 10 or 12 list to get a spot, and this series did it because it was just so good. Love this series so much. It basically follows Tisana, who is a slave when you meet her in the first book, and she breaks away from that, fights her way out tooth and nail to get her freedom. And she has magic as well. She meets Max. She travels to another part of the world to basically, she's trying to get part of this order to help her free her people, free all the people who are kept as slaves. And she meets Max, who is also has magic, and he's kind of training her, and it kind of goes from there. There's so many cool elements to this. I loved the plot. I love the world building. I love the characters and the romance. Their romance was just so strong. Max is top book boyfriend material here, people. Like, some of the quotes in that book, which I'm really bad at remembering quotes. I wish I was better because I love reading other people's when they post quotes, but I'm so bad at remembering them. But like, just ooey gooey, like, insides make you feel like that after reading that book, because he loves Tisana so much and would literally do anything for her, and it's just beautiful to read. So love this series, and it definitely deserves a spot. Okay, so that was my top 12. Now we've got the ones that I'm gonna mention as kind of like honorable mentions, just because I couldn't not. And the first one is The House in the Cerulean Sea, and that's because I don't know if this is truly a fantasy book. It's not the same vibe as the rest of these, but it's a beautiful story, and it does have fantasy elements in it. It's almost like magical realism, I'd say. So if you haven't picked this up, please do. It follows Linus Baker, and he basically goes to this orphanage and has to figure out what's going on. And it does have a romance in it that's super adorable, and just the most lovely group of characters. There's all the kids at the orphanage. Listen to the audio of this if you can, because the way they do the characterizations of the different kids is just so good. If you want a feel-good book that really touches on so many kind of important things to talk about, life lessons, you know, thinking about things in a different way, but also is just beautiful and will, I promise, leave you smiling, pick up this book. It's perfection. A couple others I wanted to mention that are more like honorable mentions. They didn't quite make top 12, but I'm gonna quickly mention them because I think they are still amazing fantasy romances. So if you need something else and you've already read a lot of the other ones, maybe pick up these. The first one being The Bridge Kingdom by Danielle L. Jensen. This is a duology with other books coming about other people. So the first two kind of wrap up the first two characters. This is really great. I love the kind of aspect of the bridge part of this. Like basically there's a large bridge that connects different parts of this world. And I just thought it was really unique in that way. The two main characters are mortal enemies. And if, like, listen, some of these other ones have been enemies to lovers, but this one is true, like, mortal enemies. Like, hate each, like, she's been basically trained, our main character, to kill the love interest. And that has been, like, her destiny. So if that's your thing, pick it up. I thought it was really well done, and I read it last year and really enjoyed. This is Caraval. This is a YA. I would say it's a YA romance, romantic fantasy. It's definitely probably more fantasy than romance, but it definitely has a strong romance in it. It follows two sisters who basically get sucked into this magical Caraval. And I feel like this is one you go in without knowing much, but just know it's gonna be good. It's 3 books, and then there is like a new series coming out that's about different characters, but it's 3 books to wrap up these two characters' stories. Or sisters' stories. And it's so good, guys. Like, it's so magical. If you really want something that's just gonna suck you in. I will say this one to me probably reads the most young adult out of all of these, and that's not a bad thing. I just think the characters are younger, and they definitely, this one's not gonna be steamy at all. It's gonna be very closed door. It's gonna be very sweet. But I definitely still recommend. It's a great series. Next, we have another YA, but I love this book, so I had to mention it, and that's Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. This is one of those where the first book by this author did not work for me. Enchantment of Ravens, it just did not work for me, which is her first book, but this one totally did. So, you know, you gotta give people a second chance. This one is, again, a YA. I would say it's a fantasy with a romance in it. Definitely, you know, very sweet, very slow burn, not gonna, you know, be anything steamy, but just so good. This one is just very magical again. It's super immersive, makes you feel like you're there. It's kind of like a cozy feel. I don't know if that's a thing, but like this one and The House on the Cerulean Sea both give me that cozy feel. You know, that I think we're all kind of looking for sometimes. And it has to do with like books, and the books in this come to life and are like basically living things. And our main character in the story basically is a librarian that takes care of these books that come to life. And there's a lot more to it. I promise you though, if you want something super fun and magical with a really cute romance in it as well, pick up this book. Okay, last 2 honorable mentions, and that is A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. So here's the thing. When I read the first 3 or 4 books in this series a couple years ago, I gave them 5 stars because it was just so different. It has to do, this is a Hades and Persephone retelling. I liked the way she set the world in kind of like our world, but not, like Olympus, but not. It was really cool. And I really liked the way they portrayed Persephone and Hades in this series. I do think I liked this a little bit more than, I liked Katie Roberts' version of it as well, with, I'm blanking on the name of it, but you know what I'm talking about. I'll put the picture up. But I think I like this series a little bit better. Looking back, it may not be a true 5-star because I've definitely read some things since then that I think were better. However, the fact that this author wrote characters that were so compelling that made me just binge these, buy them, and just like be obsessed, to me is a statement of a good book. And I do think these are worth reading, or at least trying. They're also available pretty easily at like Barnes & Noble now. So I really like this. I love Hades and Persephone. So I mean, honestly, I'm gonna read pretty much anything that is like a retelling of them. And this one is a good one. And then the last one I'm gonna mention is The Savage and the Swan by Ella Fields. Again, I read this one a few years ago, immediately bought the book because I loved it. I will say I don't remember the details as much, and I think it's just because it's a standalone and there weren't other books with these characters, so they tend to kind of like leave my mind a little bit faster. But I will say this one I definitely will say is darker than pretty much anything else I've talked about. So just know that, check your triggers before going in if you need to. But I really liked this. When I went back and read my review, I was saying it was like one of the the best fantasy romances I've read. I just thought it was different, it was unique, super dark in some ways, and the main hero is definitely a morally gray hero. Like, to the point where you're like, why am I liking this guy? Do I like this guy? But there's a twist. There's some twists in this that are pretty good too. I really liked it. So if you're looking for something a little different, pick this up. I know she has a new book coming out that's a fantasy. She's got a couple, but there's the new one that looks really good. So I'll probably pick that up soon. Okay, and then lastly, 2 series that might inch out a position on my top 12 list, but I haven't finished the series yet, so I couldn't include them, that's the Plated Prisoner series by Raven Kennedy. I really like this series. First one, I did not like that first book, but since then it's been super addicting. But I've got to catch up on this series. I've got to read book 4 still, and then the last book's not out yet, so I couldn't include it, but super addicting. I do think it's a little overhyped, just because it's so hyped, but I do still think it's a super cool take on King Midas and that whole thing, and the hero and the heroine in this are very cool characters. So definitely pick it up if you haven't. And the last one is the Bargainer series by Laura Thalassa. It's a little bit older, but I haven't finished it. I still need to read the last book. I will say it's a super solid fantasy romance though, if you're looking for something a little different. I really liked it. I thought it was something I hadn't read before about the Bargainer and just the way this whole book works. I just haven't finished the series, so I couldn't say like, you know, did she stick the landing? Did she not? And so I couldn't include it, but it's a good book as well. Okay, so those I think are my top fantasy romance books. I love this subgenre, and I definitely am excited. There's so many new ones coming out. I feel like we're definitely in our fantasy romance like era. Like, so many new authors are coming out with them. I would love to know if you have a favorite fantasy romance that's not on this list, because like I said, I'm always wanting to pick up more and new ones. So if you have one I haven't read, please let me know, because I'd love to read it and check it out. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.